Chomsky and universal grammar, folks. Okay, so this is just a reminder. Chomsky is one of a number of theories that we look at, but he's one of two basic key points of view about English language, about language acquisition in general. Obviously, we're talking English language here. And you have the idea that it is nature versus nurture. You have Skinner on the one hand, the behaviorist who believed that language was imitation and also reinforcement and essentially teaching, direct teaching by parents. It was a kind of an almost Pavlovian response. Chomsky takes a very different approach. He believes that there is something innate about language. It's what you try to avoid is saying anything particularly unequivocal, about Chomsky. Chomsky has at various stages rolled back from some of these incredibly strong claims about grammar and how it works and acquisition and how it works, about universal grammar and how it works. And because he's had the advantage of, unlike Skinner, still being around to look at other research that's gone on. There's another issue with Chomsky as well, is that actually he doesn't say very much. He makes a couple of observations and has altered them over time. And that Chomsky, being a bit of a butterfly-minded polymath, language acquisition is only one of a number of things that he's interested in. He's far more interested in politics these days. So, what did Chomsky deal with? He brought in the idea of what we call innateness. He came up with the concept of the language acquisition device, which controls the idea of development of language, a part of the brain that is responsible for language. This in itself is a problematic idea because there are examples of people who have traumatic brain injuries that kind of hit the part of the brain where language is thought to kind of nest, and they're able to reteach themselves. But there is clearly evidence that there are parts of the brain that are directly associated with language and language learning. The prefrontal cortex in particular is kind of associated with that because it's about planning and about structuring. His idea was that this part of the brain, though, allows children basically to assemble a set of rules. Initially, sort of early, but it's actually not Chomsky who says it, but people who kind of interpreted Chomsky seemed to think that what he was saying was that language was just in your brain and it would come out, and that there was a proto-language which if a child was just left alone, they'd start babbling this proto-tongue, and language would just emerge. Chomsky never really kind of said that. What he did suggest was that there was a universal grammar. Now, this universal grammar has been kind of misinterpreted to mean that people thought there was a kind of proto-grammar that was existing in the brain. What he's kind of revised his theory to suggest is that there's this capacity that allows children to assemble rules about the language that they hear, that they're actually able to observe the rules and identify them and take them and learn the rules and apply the rules to the other components of language. And it does really explain how children can say certain grammatically complex sentences that they've never ever heard before. Children start putting sentences together that they're not just repeating, and they're taking the parts and gluing them together in the way you're following the rules that they've heard. Chomsky came up with a series of what are called linguistic universals. And the first one was that babies already know these universals. And it's interesting we use the word know because that implies a kind of input of knowledge. And he's kind of rolled back on that since. And what he's suggesting is that there are sort of frameworks in the brain that are hardwired to receive language. And basically what happens is a child learns something, hears something in its native language, and that those universals help the child to kind of make a hypothesis. And I'm not imagining that there's little babies there struggling and just going, I hypothesize that the addition of the inflection upon the end of the root word suggests the point in time in which the event to which this word refers is taking place. The idea that they're hypothesizing, they're not. This is kind of, it's an instinctive understanding that these bits work in a certain way. So if you add an ed ending, it indicates that it happened sometime in the past. Language is obviously a bit more complex than that. We've looked at the idea of cognitive theory, that children have to be able to conceptualize the past before they can actually talk about it. And you look at Piaget, who talks about the idea that a child has to be able to understand a concept before they can actually talk about it. And that does make a degree of sense, because actually there are stages of language acquisition that do coincide with other developmental milestones. However, for Chomsky, he was only kind of looking at this bit. He blindly ignored the other inputs and wasn't concerned about them. And do be aware that Chomsky was relatively limited in his claims and wasn't suggesting that this was the only way that language worked, although there weren't other influences. So from this, the idea is that the baby can take this information, get a set of grammar rules, and then the more language is heard, the more the child's grammar becomes like that of an adult, which is really clear because you see that as children get older. So what does this look like? So we talk about the idea of virtuous errors to identify how universal grammar is working, because it's most obvious when children get it wrong. Now, that sounds a bit odd because children are learning grammar, but it is most obvious when they're getting it wrong. So an English-speaking child might say something like, "I goed to the park." So they put a regular past tense ed inflection on the end of an irregular verb. Now this is an irregular or strong verb. It doesn't take an inflected ending. In fact, it's actually a medial vowel. In this case, it's an entirely different word. But strong verbs tend to shift their medial vowels. So drink becomes drunk or drank, depending on whether you're using the subject or the object variant. In the case of go, it becomes went. Germanic, that wenten. It's not an inflected word, but the child has learned that the ed inflection indicates past tense, so they put it there. The child doesn't know that this is an irregular form. The child is not an idiot. The child, in fact, is actually doing something quite clever. Now, this goes against the idea of simple imitation theory, because a child would never have heard goat. They wouldn't have heard anyone saying that to them because it's not the correct verb form, and presumably they're getting reasonably accurate input. What they've done is they've overgeneralized a grammatical rule. So an overgeneralization is taking a rule that doesn't apply in a particular context and applying it in the context to which it does not apply. So what did it suggest? Well, this suggested, again, this for Chomsky really did show that there was a principle at work and that children were learning rule sets as opposed to just repeating the noises that they were hearing and then managing to tie those noises to real world objects and then later on into more abstract concepts. And that's a very compelling idea. There's a lot of support for Chomsky. All around the world, children go through similar stages of acquisition and they do similar things. The idea of overgeneralization of grammatical rules occurs beyond the English language. However, and medical research, of course, does identify that there are parts of the brain that do control language, although there is some redundancy built into the brain. There are clearly areas that are heavily involved in language production. None of these ideas really suggest, however, that language will just appear. And Chomsky doesn't actually say that himself either. Stephen Pinker, another linguist, I suppose, philosopher, writer, talks about that humans are born with an innate capacity for language. He sees it as a kind of an instinct which evolves because it's effective, and he kind of talks about the idea that language functions by conveying messages and negotiating social relationships. So he looks at language from a much more functional point of view. So what to look out for when you're in data? So children doing something more than simply parroting back adult speech, over and under extension of rules, again showing an unconscious application of how language functions. Children resisting and not responding to correction, thinking that they will have their own rule which they will hold on to until they're ready to absorb the adult rule. All of these things can be used to support Chomsky's work. There are some problems. The problems aren't necessarily with the theory. The problems are more with how limited the theory is. Chomsky didn't really pay much attention to child development. He was just focused on and really interested in the hardwired nature of language. Almost more an anthropological study than it was a linguistic one, which would be about right for Noam Chomsky. And that's where he started. So he accepted that interaction was there. He doesn't really talk much about it. But again, that's mainly because that's just not what he's interested in. And frankly, as there are issues with many, many linguists who, particularly polymath linguists, who go off and they say one thing about something and then go off and study something completely different, he didn't really do any practical experiments. It was mainly theory and some casual observation. Since then, a lot of other people have done a lot of extra work to make that theory a bit stronger. So there you go, Chomsky and universal grammar.